Good morning to the distinguished speakers, our technical team, and the discerning audience. Anekdhara, as you know, is a public policy group and portal set up by retired civil servants. What we share in common is a worldview that is centered on liberal and progressive social values. Deeply disappointed with the high octane but superficial discourse on both the mainline and social media, we focus on a deeper and nuanced understanding of the issues at hand. Keeping in line with the objective, we host a website called anekdhara.in and hold monthly webinars. This is the 16th webinar in the series, and the topic is Indian growth story. Why has employment failed to keep pace? Unemployment rate in India rose to 6.1% in the 2017 and 18 fiscal year, highest in at least 45 years, the Statistics Ministry said on 31st May 2019. According to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, CMIE, unemployment rate in the country surged in December 2022 to 8.30 and stood at 7.8% in March 2023. While in states like Haryana, unemployment reached to a staggering 34.5%. The claims or figures that India has been growing faster than most of the major economies fly in the face of the grim reality of rising unemployment. While the promise of 2 crore jobs a year remain a promise, the leaders are busy in identifying who is a vicious snake and who is Vishakanya, who abused whom and how many times, and so on and so forth. They seem to have no time for trivial issues like unemployment, social inefficiency, etc. India's job creation problem is morphing into a greater threat. Frustrated at not being able to find the right kind of job, millions of Indians, particularly women, are exiting the labor force entirely and no longer even looking for work. Between 2017 and 2022, the overall labor participation rate dropped from 46% to 40%. Among women, the data is even starker. About 21 million women disappeared from the workforce, leaving only 9% of the eligible population employed or looking for positions. Now, more than half of the 900 million Indians of legal working age, roughly the population of the US and Russia combined, don't want a job, according to the CMIE. Confirming the fears of jobless growth or employment growth has not kept pace with economic growth, domestic rating agency K Ratings said in 2017, employment generation has not kept pace with GDP expansion, terming it a major concern. In 2023, the situation seems to have only worsened. Can temporary interventions like ban on food exports and distributing food to almost 1/3 of the Indian population address the fundamental problem of large-scale unemployment? There is a historical disconnect in the Indian growth story where growth essentially happens without a corresponding increase in employment, said Mahesh Vyas, the chief executive of the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. Indians seem to be helpless witnesses of Nero leadership fiddling Jumla Baji, while India is burning in unemployment and social inefficiency. We are sure that the distinguished guests of the day will provide deeper insights into the imbroglio, its causes, and the way out of the impasse. While the learned professors Prabhat Patnaik and Santosh Mehrotra provide the expert analysis, Sri Partho P of the Wake Up India movement will moderate the session. Educated at the prestigious St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, XLRA Jamshedpur, International Management Institute, Delhi, and the London School of Economics, Partho has been the new age leader for more than 35 years with substantive P&L experience and well-rounded national and international exposure in creating organizations from scratch. He was CEO, Madurai Garments of Aditya Birla Group, CEO, Apparel Business of Arvind Mafatlal Group, and Executive Director and President of the House of Pearl Fashions. He is one of the trailblazers in Indian retail business and built a national retail chain and brand called Stencil in 1987 itself. He pioneered the concept of third-party social audit in manufacturing, got a third-party social audit done by Oxfam in 1995, and got outstanding ratings from which BBC gave a global coverage, telling it is a socially conscious organization. Indian Parliament Subcommittee recognized this effort in its report on excellent manufacturing in 1998. Currently, he serves as director on JK Enterprises Limited, JK Technosoft Limited, and New Mesh Labs Private Limited, and developing a portfolio of digital manufacturing, defense, and aerospace business. Partho has contributed in the national textile policy making of Government of India. He sits on the boards of several prestigious educational institutions and trusts. He is a trustee of Sarvodaya Ashram, one of the oldest Khadi institutions founded by Vinoba Bhave. He was instrumental in conceptualization and creation of Khadi Center of Excellence of the Government of India. He has been the chief consultant to the West Bengal government since 2013 for conceptualization and execution of Bishwa Bangla, an initiative to establish brand Bengal and to popularize its unique culture, textile, craft, literature, and cuisine, while creating jobs at the bottom of the pyramid. This pioneering initiative in artisanal retail has helped in reviving many lost traditional skills in Bengal since 2014. And currently, this engages a lakh artisans with sustainable livelihood opportunities. Many Indian states are studying this model for adoption, and he has already made a strategy report for Telangana government to start a similar initiative to revive textile and crafts of Telangana. Partho was on the drafting committee of IIM Bill 2012 of MHRD Government of India, which became enacted later. He was a board member of IIM Lucknow from 1997 to 2018. During last 25 years, he has been involved with national institutions like NIFT and Pearl Academy. He was the vice chairman of Sir Padampat Singhania schools in Kanpur and Kota. He is also a board member of JK Business School, Gurgaon, and GHS IMR, Kanpur. Partho works extensively in diverse areas of social sector like spinning and weaving of muslin, production and marketing of honey from Sundarbans, helping local societies to build primary schools, etc. Partho received the British Chevening Gurukul Scholarship in 1997 and the Distinguished Alumnus Award of International Management Institute, Delhi in 2006 in recognition of his contribution to business as well as societal development. Happy to hand over the baton to you, sir, to wake up India, to Sri Partho.
Thank you, Seraji. It's a great pleasure and honor to moderate a session with two eminent economists of India. And I can assure you that this is going to be a very interesting session. But before going further, let me first, although I don't have the capabilities to introduce such big educationists as Professor Patnaik and Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, but I would still make an effort to introduce them. Dr. Prabhat Patnaik as you know, is an emeritus professor from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was a professor at the Center of Economic Studies Planning in the School of Social Sciences at JNU in New Delhi. He was vice chairman of the planning board of the Indian state of Kerala. Dr. Patnaik had a very illustrious academic background. He actually studied at the St. Stephen's College. He's an economics honors graduate from St. Stephen's, and also a BPhil and DPhil from the University of Oxford, both from Balliol and Nuffield colleges. He joined the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at the University of Cambridge in 1969 and was elected a Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge in 1974. However, he decided to return back to India and he came to the Jawaharlal Nehru University as an associate professor and worked since then in the department of CESP, and he also held the Sukhumai Chakravarti chair in planning and development. He has been the dean of the School of Social Sciences at the JNU. His specialization is macroeconomics and political economy, areas in which he has written a number of books and articles. His books include Time, Inflation and Growth in 1988, Economics and Egalitarianism in 1990, very interesting book on whatever happened to the imperialism and other essays in 1995, Accumulation and Stability under Capitalism in 1997, and Retreat to Unfreedom in 2003, and many more. He has been an editor of Social Scientist, which under his stewardship has become a very highly effective vehicle for progressive ideas and fertile research. Interestingly, he is an honorary doctorate from SOAS in London, and he is a recipient of the Malcolm Ardeshia Award. Welcome to this session, sir. Our next speaker is Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, another distinguished gentleman. He is a visiting professor at the Center for Development at the Bath University in UK, was professor of economics, Center for Labour, JNU. Also, he was a research fellow at the IZA Institute of Labour Economics, Bonn. He is also a professorial senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. He is an MA in economics from New School for Social Research in New York, and he is a PhD in economics from Cambridge University. He was the head of UNICEF's Global Research Program at Innocenti Research Center in Florence and chief economist of Global Human Development Report, New York from 1991 to 2006. He was head Development Policy Division of India's Planning Commission and also Director General of National Institute of Labour Economics and Research in between 2006 and 2014. He has published 13 books, including 3 with Cambridge University Press, 4 with Oxford University Press, others by Sage Routledge, Jet Press, Penguin. His work has been translated into Hindi, Spanish, French, Russian, German, and Portuguese. So welcome, gentlemen, to this session. And interestingly, on the lighter side, today we are going to have Oxford and Cambridge debate on an Indian platform. It will be very interesting to hear both of them. Well, for today's discussion, I want to say a few things before I hand over the platform to the main speakers of today. In 2013, the World Bank report brought out the debate of jobs on the center stage, jobs and jobless growth. Some of the issues which were highlighted by that report, the World Bank report of 2013, was jobs versus growth. So something like Piketty's R is greater than G equation. Development of entrepreneurship. While jobs can contribute to social cohesion, can government do something about it other than supporting job creation? Are investments in education and skill development a prerequisite, or skill can be built through jobs? Should efforts be made to improve investments into labor-intensive areas of production? Will job creation of one country come at the cost of another country? In fact, I would like to quote a quote from New York Times, where Stiglitz said that global employment in manufacturing is going down as productivity growth exceeds demand by a large margin. So basically, the aggregate global demand is much less than the aggregate installed capacity of goods to be produced. during shocks, is it advisable to protect people or jobs? And we just actually, this is a 2013 report preamble, and we saw this in 2020 when the whole world was hit by COVID. Uh, is there an opportunity to control labor migration to greater potential areas? I mean, so today's discussion, based on this, we would like to today hear from our speakers the meaning of this jobless growth. What does it mean? What is jobless growth? Then we would like them to also put forth some light on genesis of this jobless growth in India. And based on this, I would like to also say that did we miss the bus post World War II in terms of economic history, when there was a sudden demand of labor-intensive goods in the West, and based on which countries like Japan and Southeast Asia substantially benefited, and then subsequently Japan in China in 80s. Have we missed the bus, or still there is an opportunity to pick up, at least considering that our domestic market is pretty large? And why has this jobless growth become so important suddenly? Why is there additional focus on this jobless growth today in India? What has happened in the last decade that has caused so much of such kind of enormous pressure on the job market? A reason for this sudden increase in intensity of joblessness in India? What is the solution in front of us? How do we address these issues? What kind of policy intervention is needed? Is it too little, too late? What could be the possible outcomes of this escalating global inequality? Because that has also become a major issue. That what could be the possible outcomes if this huge inequality that keeps growing? How would it impact the society in general? I think Professor Prabhat Patnaik it will be very interesting to hear his views on this. And gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I would now hand over the mic to our first eminent speaker of the day, Professor Dr. Prabhat Patnaik. Prabhat sir, to you, hand over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity which has been given to me to address this audience. I would like to, before I come to India, I'd like to discuss some general conceptual issues about unemployment. See, there is a lot of misconception. If you take a modern capitalist economy, in that case, the capitalist sector certainly grows at the expense of pre-capitalist production, petty production, small-scale production, and so on. That's something which is observed all over the world. Unless there are barriers to it, the tendency of the capitalist sector would be to encroach upon the area occupied by the pre-capitalist sector, and thereby generate employment, because per unit of output, the capitalist sector employs fewer people than the pre-capitalist sector. This we have seen in Indian history, deindustrialization, and so on. So that, that would necessarily generate some unemployment. But there is a general belief that this unemployment would more or less be overcome within a short period of time, because of the fact that the capitalist sector would inevitably, because it employs per unit of output fewer people, then you would find that the rate of profit would be higher. And since profits generate investment or generate resources for investment, the rate of investment would be higher. Therefore, the rate of growth would be higher. Therefore, the rate of growth of employment would be higher. And therefore, over a period of time, whatever unemployment is created through the capitalist sector encroaching on the pre-capitalist or the petty production sector is something that would be more or less wiped out. Not only would it be wiped out, but in fact, whatever labor reserves may have existed in the economy beforehand will also get exhausted. Now, this is an idea which originally in a different way was put forward by the well-known English economist David Ricardo. And this is an idea which has continued since then. That, okay, capitalism does create. Ricardo's concern was with the introduction of machinery. The introduction of machinery generates unemployment, but he said the introduction of machinery creates a rate of employment growth over a period of time, which is much higher than before, and therefore whatever unemployment it may generate temporarily would get overcome. So this idea is something which generally has been accepted, that basically with capitalist growth, we would be, and with a high rate of growth like we have been having in India, we should be overcoming the unemployment problem. But that entire conception is not necessarily valid, because that conception makes two assumptions. That when we talk about, let's say, introduction of machinery, we talk about a one-shot introduction of machinery. That, okay, you have pre-machine production, you have post-machine production. But the point is, capitalism is characterized by continuous technological progress, by continuous changes in technology and in the structure of production, which basically economizes on labor. And therefore, you actually have a continuous process, not a one shot, but a continuous process of change taking place. The second thing, second assumption, which Ricardo made, that which most of economists make, who argue along those lines, is that that if you have a higher rate of profit, you have a higher rate of investment, and therefore you have a higher rate of growth. The fact that investment may slacken because there is not enough demand in the economy, the fact that investment and therefore the rate of growth may in fact fall because you don't have enough demand in the economy, is something which is really missed by them. In economics, this is said, a belief in Say's law. Say had said, the French economist, that supply creates its own demand. There is never a demand problem. But the moment you look at the demand problem, then this assumption breaks down. In fact, in economics, you have all these views. Like, for instance, a very well-known economist, Arthur Lewis, who got a Nobel Prize for economics, has this well-known model in which you have the capitalist sector, a modern sector, which introduces a new technology. The wage rate does not differ much immediately. I mean, it is at subsistence level, but because the labor productivity is higher, surplus is higher, therefore the growth rate is higher. And with that high growth rate, sooner or later, you actually absorb the entire labor force from the traditional sector. That is called the basically transformation that takes place in the economy. Now, even that assumes that both there is no demand problem, and also that technology is really a one-shot affair, that it's a modern technology, but a one-shot introduction of modern technology, not a continuous technological progress. As a matter of fact, therefore, there is no reason, if you believe that there is continuous technological progress, and if you believe that investment may be constrained because there is not enough demand in the economy, why either capitalism should absorb the unemployment it created when it was encroaching on the pre-capitalist or petty production sectors, or even use up the labor reserve that happened to exist in the economy, or even generate a rate of growth of employment that is greater than the natural rate of growth of the workforce. So unless you make this specific assumption, there is no reason why in a capitalist economy, where the modern sector is a capitalist sector, you should actually have unemployment disappearing. The fact that in Europe it disappeared, which is why we generally get these ideas about capitalism giving rise to a disappearance of unemployment, is because of the fact that there was massive emigration of workers from Europe to the new temperate lands of white settlement. United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where what the European migrants did was to get rid of the local population from their land, grab that land, and of course, thereby attain a reasonably high standard of living. Again, Arthur Lewis, whose name I mentioned earlier, estimates that in the long 19th century, that means roughly, let us say, from the middle of the 19th century until 1914, 50 million Europeans emigrated to these new lands. And of course, when they emigrated, then the local unemployment disappeared, or largely was reduced. And after that, there was no question of there being a kind of serious unemployment problem. The other way in which Europe overcame this problem is because much of the encroachment that European capitalism did on the petty production, handicrafts, handloom sector was encroachment that was done in the colonies. Therefore, unemployment was created in India because European capitalism was really encroaching on the Indian market. Now, because of this, unless I believe you have some constraints on the pace of technological change, and unless you ensure that demand is not a problem, there is no reason why with growth unemployment should disappear. As a matter of fact, in our lifetime, or say my lifetime, in the more recent periods, the only countries in the world that actually overcame unemployment and experienced labor shortage because of their growth experience were the former socialist countries, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on. And they did so because of the fact that the pace of technological change was controlled, and also because of the fact they were planned economies where there was never a demand constraint. The government always made sure that there was enough demand in the economy and there was never a demand constraint. Now, this idea that you really need to have some kind of a control on the pace of technological change is an idea, oddly enough, which was really understood and espoused by Gandhiji. As a matter of fact, I believe Gandhiji had a much better understanding of unemployment problem than most professional economists do. Of course, he did not want the state to intervene in preventing rapid technological and structural change that raises labor productivity and therefore creates unemployment. But he actually thought that people would automatically change their consumption and demand patterns in such a way that actually unemployment would not be created. I mean, as he said in one of his articles, that why should I adopt the fineries of Bond Street if it is the case that my doing so makes my brother, the artisan in the neighboring village, unemployed? And therefore, his idea was that people would generally deliberately constrain their patterns of demand in such a way that employment is generated. But the idea that to overcome unemployment, you would have to have some restraint on the pace of technological change was really understood very clearly by Gandhi. And of course, also, though he did not mention it, some kind of an mechanism to ensure that there is never a demand problem. Now, in India, in the earlier period, before liberalization, we actually did not have a demand problem because it was a kind of planned economy in which, I mean, planned in not in the sense of central planning, but nonetheless some kind of a planned economy in which the government ensured that there was never a demand problem. If anything, there was, in fact, a tendency towards excess demand. And what is more, there were some kind of constraints on technological change because of what is sometimes derisively called the quota license permit Raj. You actually could not just introduce technological change when you wanted. With neoliberalism, both of these things go, because on the one hand, the demand problem surfaces because the government, which earlier through fiscal means could overcome any problem of demand, is now prevented from doing so because there's a constraint on the fiscal deficit and there's a constraint on the ability of the government to tax the rich. You know, if you tax the poor and government spends, then there's hardly much net addition of demand because the poor were consuming whatever tax amount that the government takes away anyway. And therefore, there is hardly any net addition to demand. Net addition to demand would arise only when the government either can tax the rich or not tax at all and spend, which is what we call a fiscal deficit. But a fiscal deficit is not allowed. There's some constraint on it because of the FRBM Act in neoliberalism. And of course, taxing the rich is out. Therefore, a demand problem arises, as we are witnessing at this very moment. And secondly, you find that there is no constraints on technological change which go because of the fact that if your economy is open to exports, in that case, you cannot have constraints on technological change or even structural change, because of the fact that if you did so, then your domestic industries would become uncompetitive, domestic activities become uncompetitive internationally, and therefore you have other countries' goods taking over your market, and that is not something which is going to generate any employment in your economy. Therefore, under neoliberalism, both the checks which had existed earlier on the kind of spontaneous working of capitalism, or spontaneous working of a modern sector which is dominated by capitalism, both of them actually disappear, which is why, even though we have had an acceleration in the rate of growth, the problem of unemployment has become even more acute, far more acute. As a matter of fact, of course, unemployment is very difficult to measure in India because of the fact that if a given amount of job is actually distributed among a larger number of people, then everybody gets unemployed to a greater extent, but it may not show itself in terms of open unemployment. In other words, what shows itself in terms of open unemployment would actually be only a small proportion of the unemployment problem. But if you take crudely, you find that while our rate of GDP growth has doubled between the earlier period and the period of liberalization, the rate of growth of jobs has roughly halved between the earlier period and the current period. 2% per annum, let us say earlier, about 1% per annum on an average in the more recent period, while the GDP growth rate was about 4% per annum earlier, about 8% per annum, a bit less perhaps in the subsequent period. And I believe that this disjunction between employment growth and GDP growth has been essentially caused by the fact that there has been a very high rate of technological progress, perforce necessitated because the economy is now open to trade competitiveness from outside countries, and therefore, and it, all restraints on technological change and structural change thereby are restraints which go. Also, because the pattern of demand has been shifting, you have an increase in income inequality. Because if you have growing unemployment, then that necessarily implies that your wages don't really rise in proportion as your labor productivity rises. Therefore, the share of the surplus rises. And with the rise in the share of the surplus, since you basically have a shift from workers' income to surplus in income distribution, since the workers consume a larger proportion of their income than the surplus earners, there is a reduction that takes place in the level of demand. And this is something that slows down the economy. That's happening as an international phenomenon, which also affects us. Exports are not growing as rapidly because the world economy has slowed down, exactly, in my view, because of growing income inequality. And likewise, there is an increase in income inequality domestically, because of which demand has slowed down, because of which you now find that unemployment has really appeared in a very serious manner, or what economists would say, that in addition to technological unemployment, you now have the unemployment of insufficient demand superimposed on it, or which is sometimes referred to as Keynesian unemployment, because of the general rise in the level of unemployment. It follows, therefore, that unless we can actually have, in my view, some constraints on the pace of technological change. I mean, I think many of us had objected, for instance, to the fact of Walmart coming in, because we were afraid that Walmart coming in would throw lots of retail traders out of business. Now, the point is that that kind of a common sense heuristic understanding has to be generalized for the economy as a whole, which basically means there has to be some constraints on the pace of technological come structural change, because structural change sometimes usually goes hand in hand with technological change. So there has to be some restraints on the pace of technological come structural change. And at the same time, the economy must not be a demand constrained economy, so that Keynesian unemployment is out. Now, both these require that the kind of economic regime in which we have been in since the days of liberalization has to be altered. Because as I said, with trade openness, as we become exposed to competition from outside, you cannot put controls on the rate of technological come structural change, because outside it is taking place. And if it's taking place outside, then you cannot really have domestic industries going on with the old technology, because then they would just get outcompeted. So you'd have to have some restraints on trade as well, because obviously such an economy cannot be an economy that is open completely or more or less completely to trade from outside. And secondly, it would also mean that you have to have government intervention to ensure that there is no problem of demand. And that basically is something which is resisted. Government intervention for overcoming inadequate demand is resisted by globalized finance, which is why we have FRBM and so on. Similarly, if you have any taxation of the rich, then there is always a fear that globalized finance would leave the economy, would migrate en masse somewhere else, creating a financial crisis here. Because of that, there have to be constraints or checks, restraints on the movement of financial flows. Therefore, some control on trade flows and some control on financial flows, which is a precondition for controlling the pace of technological change and ensuring that there's no Keynesian unemployment, have to characterize a new economic regime. Now, that economic regime obviously cannot be classical capitalism. And of course, therefore, we have to have some such restraints before we can really make a dent on the problem of unemployment. I would personally argue that even before we have made a dent on the problem of unemployment, the government should, the society should, in fact, introduce a right to employment for everybody, by which I mean that if employment is not provided, then the person should be entitled to a certain wage rate that is statutorily fixed beforehand. In fact, I would like to argue in favor of introducing 5 fundamental economic rights on a par with the political rights which we have, namely a right to food, right to employment, right to free healthcare of the kind that the National Health Service provides in Britain or in the Scandinavian countries, a right to free quality education provided, universal, provided by the state, and a right to old age pension and disability benefit, which is a living amount. But I think if we do that, I believe we have enough resources if we can tax the rich, but the economic regime within which we can tax the rich and introduce these measures would have to be different from the economic regime that we have today in a way that I have suggested. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. It was a great pleasure hearing you. We have got some important pointers which you spoke about, essentially the impact of technology and create demand creation, which will result in better, higher employment. And also your point on right to employment, which is interesting, can be debated, and we need to really find out what would be an impact for this kind of a thing for a country like ours. Right to food, employment, healthcare, some of this government of India has already implemented. Perhaps we need to see the real impact and the outcome of such interventions. I would now request Dr. Mehrotra to start his discourse, and we look forward to some interesting questions that are already being raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Partho. And I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. And I'm really glad that Prabhat went before me. And I agree with almost everything that Prabhat had to say. And I'm going to sort of elaborate on some of the things that he spoke about. This is the title of my presentation. And what we are seeing, unfortunately, is that in the last decade or so, the whole process of structural change, which was slow in any case, but had begun, unfortunately has been reversed, and it's a subject that I will come back to very shortly. So this is the structure of my presentation. I'll speak about how there has been a reversal of structural change in recent years, the kind of structural change of output and employment that Prabhat was talking about, away from agriculture to industry and services, both in output and employment. And then I'll speak also about what the components of what I believe could be a manufacturing strategy for India, which unfortunately India has not had, partly on account of this domination of neoliberal thinking for the last 30 odd years. We've never had an explicit industrial policy. And essentially what I would argue, in the light of what Prabhat has explained to us very well, is that there is still potential and possibilities, and you will hear me explore those. Let me start, however, by talking about conceptually the demographic dividend that we keep hearing about. And I feel we need to define this term because there is a fair bit of confusion around it among the lay audience in particular, but even among very often policymakers and even some academics. I just want to make 2 points about it. It is that period, the dividend is defined as that period in the life of a nation which comes but once in the life of a nation. It comes and it goes away. I don't think this is sufficiently recognized by even the intelligentsia in our country. In our country, the dividend began in the early 1980s. It will end by the 2040s. It is defined as that period when the share of the working age population in the total population is rising and the share of the dependent population in the total population is falling, the dependent population being those under 15 and those over 60 or 64. So the working age share rising is how the DD is defined. And it's very important that some 40 of the 60 years of our dividend are already over. And therefore, the crisis, in a sense, the structural crisis that Prabhat was talking about is so serious, and we need to recognize it. The other thing I want to highlight for the benefit of the audience is that while we still are in a stage of our dividend where the working age share of the population is rising, the point is that in this decade, at least until 2030, it is rising at an accelerating pace. So the problem of unemployment is actually worsening practically by the day, and if it's not addressed head on. The other point I think we need to note is that in the next decade, between 2030 and 2040, the working age share of the population will still be rising. So therefore, we have to provide, continue to provide more jobs than we are currently providing. But at least the working age share will be increasing at a decelerating pace. It is after 2040 that the working age share of the population will begin to contract, and we will become slowly like China, whose dividend actually ended between 2012 and 2015. So one foundational point that I want to establish at the beginning is that we need to create at least 10 million non-farm jobs per annum. And this we have to do in a context where both causes for unemployment that Prabhat spoke about, technological change and demand being constrained, still very much hold. So how can we do it? I will actually address that. Let me just make 2 points to nuance the broader argument that Prabhat made, that in our recent history from about 2000 to 2012, the data shows that this economy has succeeded in generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs each year. Each year. We now have to generate more precisely for the reason that I've just been accelerating, because those in the working age are actually rising at an accelerating pace, a subject I'll come back to. But the point is, there is hope. We've done it before for 12 years, but unfortunately, since this government came to power, for a variety of reasons, which I might come back to, from 7.5 million new non-farm jobs being created, we are down to 2.9 million per annum. The second reason for hope that I would hold out is that East Asia, despite the East Asian countries, despite technological change that they were undergoing, did manage to create demand and did manage to thus generate labor-intensive manufacturing jobs. And they managed to create demand not just, of course, through their export orientation, because they were relatively smaller economies. But, China is not a small economy, and yet it has both taken advantage of export markets as well as its own domestic market. But let me move on very quickly in the interest of time. So why do I call this a looming crisis? There are three groups that have to be provided jobs. One are, of course, the farmlandless, the small marginal farmers. We know that farmers themselves don't want to remain in farming, especially the young educated. But the bigger, deeper structural reason is that plots, because population growth rate, plot sizes have been dropping, they've dropped very sharply. Farmers want to leave agriculture. They had begun to leave agriculture in massive numbers, a subject I'll come back to in a minute. But where do they go if the non-farm jobs being created has fallen so sharply? The second group that we need to provide work for are the youth, as I said, who are entering the labor force. Youth defined as 15 to 29-year-olds. Roughly about 5 to 6 million youth are joining the labor force every year. This is accelerating till 2030. And these have all gotten much better educated. Primary enrollment touched 97% net in 2007. Secondary enrollment had reached, between 2010 and 2015, it shot up from 58% to 85%. Higher education enrollment has also shot up. But so clearly, all these young people are entering the labor force in larger and larger numbers. And of course, they won't work in agriculture, they won't work in industry and services. A subgroup that we need to think about a little bit, and I'll have occasion to talk about it briefly, is the girls, the youthful girls. Their labor force participation rate has been falling. Thank God that, thanks to the investment in school education that took place in the 90s and in the first decade of this century, gender parity was achieved along with high secondary enrollment. The trouble is these girls have few skills and they all aspire for non-farm jobs. 76%, a recent survey said, aspire for not getting married, but for looking for non-farm work. The third big group, of course, we have to employ are the currently unemployed. On account of the drop in the number of jobs being created in the non-farm sector, they're openly unemployed, who were only 10 million in 2012. That number tripled to 30 million in 2019. It has increased further to 37 million in 2021. And notice that I've said so far nothing about the quality of employment. Unfortunately, I mean, it's a subject I won't be able to say much about. I can come back to, though I can, wholeheartedly endorse Prabhat's point about, the need for social security, old age pension, because the quality of our employment is appalling. 91% of those who even have employment are informal. They are without social security. Now, let me turn to the sort of main point very briefly. There has been a reversal of structural change. This table shows it. Can you see the dates here? 1993, 2012, and 2018. The blue bars are showing manufacturing share of GDP The orange bars are showing manufacturing share of employment. You can see that at least in the first 20 years after the economic reforms began, the manufacturing share was stable at around 17%. Manufacturing share of employment was rising, but since then it has actually fallen. And this is the year you will recall that we hit the highest open unemployment rate, and things have only worsened since then. So a process of slow or gradual structural change that was setting in actually got reversed. Let me move on. And right. So I'm going to move very quickly through this. Actually, believe it or not, most recently, the manufacturing share of GVA, gross value added, fell even below the 17% point or 15% point. It has actually fallen well below that. I'm going to keep moving rapidly through this. And in fact, tragedy is manufacturing employment fell in absolute terms, mainly because unorganized manufacturing fell, and it fell in 5 most labor-intensive sectors, because the MSMEs were damaged by demonetization, by an unplanned GST, and by, of course, a very poorly implemented lockdown. Let me quickly move on. This is a very important slide I want you to focus your attention on, because you see, all the way from 1951 to 2004, while the share of workers employed in agriculture had been falling, the absolute number of workers in agriculture had still been increasing. They had been increasing even in the first 5 years of this century at this rate, 4.4 million persons joining agriculture annually. So in other words, until then, the process of structural change was actually very slow. However, as the growth rate picks up post 2004, 5 to 14, just to recall for the benefit of our entire audience, the growth rate picked up to an unprecedented 8% per annum. I was in the Planning Commission over that period. I can talk about that later, but 2004 to 14, our growth rate was sort of 8% per annum. And believe it or not, because we were generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs per annum over this period, this is 2005 to 12, we were pulling the absolute number of workers in agriculture was falling at the rate of 5.5 million per annum. And that process did continue despite, after that till 2018, primarily because although non-farm job growth had slowed, there were still jobs being created in the non-farm sector. Now look what happens, thanks to the very poor economic policy management during COVID. We've been told that 10 million was the number of workers who reverse migrated to agriculture in 2020. Periodic labor force survey of the NSSO informs us, this is my analysis, that 45 million new workers were added to agriculture in 2020 alone. And believe it or not, during the second wave, an additional 8.3 million were added on. So something like 25% of the total agricultural workforce was added on in a sector which already was producing, only 15% of GDP with 42% of the workforce. And the share of the workforce in agriculture actually shoots up to 46+%. This is the other dimension of the structural change being reversed. Moving on very rapidly, I think I'm going to sort of skip through this very, very quickly. If there was one sector which was generating jobs more recently, it was services. Manufacturing was generating some jobs, but certainly not sufficient. But most of the service sector jobs were in the modern tradable sectors, which require, of course, skilled workers, which means that the vast majority who were moving out of agriculture were getting employed either in construction, where clearly the wages were higher, subject I'll come back to, or in traditional services. The result of this, process where job creation fell in recent years. At the same time, the numbers who were looking for work increased. You have youth unemployment rates, which actually shoot up. Notice here we've got open unemployment rates for 15 to 29-year-olds by level of education. Just look for a minute at secondary education. The blue bar is 2012, the orange bar is 2020, and in the interest of time, I just want to show you what happened to what happened to wages. You see, when non-farm job growth stops, real wages stop rising. However, the important point is that between this is showing regular salaried workers' wages in rural and urban. The second panel here to the right is showing casual wages, rural and urban. And the point I want you to pay attention to is that between 2004 and 11-12, when non-farm jobs were growing rapidly, you can see real wages increasing quite sharply here to here. However, post-2012, when the non-farm job growth really slows down, real wages either contract or they remain flat. Only in the case of casual workers, they tend to sort of increase because construction jobs were still increasing. But this becomes very different after 17-18, which is what I want to show you now. You can see here in agriculture, 17-18 to 22, and it's pretty much flat, whether you're talking of self-employed earnings or casual workers. Similarly, manufacturing, the blue line is self-employed, regular workers, casual workers, and between 17-18 and 2022, it's flat. This is because the non-farm jobs are not growing. Right, the same thing happening here in non-manufacturing, mainly dominated by construction, and similar things happening in the most recent period in services. The result of this is, I estimate actually between 17-18 and 22, what happens to the poverty gap. Now, I even do it by state, but I have no time to go into that. I just need you to appreciate the bottom row here, where it's showing that those on average who are below the poverty line, I'm talking about the Tendulkar poverty line, the poverty gap between those the poverty gap essentially is a measure of the average income of those who are below the poverty line and the income they could have received if they'd gone over the poverty line. So the poverty gap was only 0.6 in 17-18, high enough, but it actually worsened by 2022. So you can see that when job growth is not happening in the non-farm sector, and what that results in is poverty increasing, real wages stagnating, and therefore demand not increasing. If demand was increasing as non-farm jobs were growing at 7.5 million per annum between 2004 and 12, you get a growth rate and job growth simultaneously with it. In other words, India has demonstrated that it is possible to generate many more jobs, provided we have the right policies. I'm not saying that all the policies in the previous period before 2014 were right. There were very serious problems with it. I've written about it. I'll come back to this subject in a minute, because I'm going to speak about what are the actions that could be taken and should be taken, but are not being taken. I've already spoken about this. The trouble is, unless the government even recognizes that we've got a problem, and I've already demonstrated that there is a very serious problem, then we're not going to see any corrective action. I mean, I agree entirely with Professor Patnaik that we need a right to employment. At the very least, we need an employment policy. But an employment policy that must go hand in hand with an industrial policy, a subject I'm turning to very briefly, very shortly, by way of sort of answers to this, this tragic situation. But first of all, I mean, the government needs to stop spreading disinformation, especially the government economists, that there is really not much of a problem. I mean, I could talk about this, but maybe I'll come back to this in the question and answer session. However, there's one slide I want you to focus your attention on. The performance-linked incentive scheme, which is much talked about. It is something that the government has been tom-tomming. By way of introduction to the PLI, let me just remind you that the government has also been tom-tomming the Make in India initiative, but the Make in India initiative quite clearly failed miserably and catastrophically, as the data that I've just been showing you has already demonstrated. Now, there are several types of problems with the PLI, wherein about 14 sectors have been selected to be given a series of subsidies if they increase their output. And where is the problem with the PLI? Because I don't believe PLI is really a industrial policy, a subject I'm returning to in a minute. What are the problems? The first problem is that the PLI is based on picking winning firms rather than sectors, which is the opposite of the East Asia model. You know, I began my presentation by talking about how East Asia managed to create both domestic demand and utilize foreign demand, and thereby managed to generate labor-intensive manufacturing jobs. That the technique was not to pick winning firms, they focused on sectors. Now, second problem with PLI is that 11 of the 13 or 14 sectors are capital intensive. Well, how are choosing capital intensive sectors in a new scheme, which is supposed to be a proxy for industrial policy, actually generate jobs? That itself is a problem. The third problem is giving the bureaucracy a role in picking of the winners, which sort of harks back a little bit to the rent-seeking license permit Raj. Fourthly, there are significant fiscal costs of the PLI, actually rupees 1.9 trillion over the next 5 years. And when in fact funds are needed today for investing in human capital, especially in improving the quality of school education, getting our children into vocational education and training, improving the quality of our higher education, and above all in R&D. And if I have time, I'll speak about this. Fifthly, there is a risk that the demand for the extension of benefits being given under PLI might grow beyond 5 years, because there's a scheme available only for 5 years. And finally, the problem is that there's no expectation from these winning firms that they will be expected to export, which is again the opposite of East Asia. So quickly, I'm going to turn to a few points which spell out what, in my view, are the components of an industrial policy. In the next 7 or 8 minutes, as I close, I'm going to spell out about 7 components of what could be a coherent manufacturing policy, which is aligned to export and import policy. One of the problems with our whole approach to industry and industrialization is that we didn't understand that as we reduce tariffs very rapidly, we also introduced what is called an inverted duty structure. So the first problem with the reduction of tariffs, which were running at 150% in 1990, it would happen very fast, from 150 to 40% in 1998 to about 10% in 2002. But the problem is not just that they were very fast. Unlike China, we allowed our tariffs to fall below the WTO upper boundaries. which affected our small and large manufacturers adversely. This was problem number one in the way we carried out our neoliberal economic reforms. The second problem was the sequence. What do I mean by that? You will recall from 1956 all the way till 1990, we had reservation of products, growing number of products reserved for the small scale industries, 836 products finally by 1991. Believe it or not, after the economic reforms began, we reduced the reservation of products extremely slowly. And tragically, we opened up to the world market. We encouraged tariffs coming down and therefore encouraged imports of finished products without ending this reservation. In other words, we permitted international competition first instead of allowing these small SSIs to actually face domestic competition first. We inverted the sequence which we should have followed. And finally, what happened to the structure of tariffs itself? Post the free trade agreements that we began signing from 2002 onwards, we've allowed the following tariff structure to emerge, which is what I call the inverted duty structure. That finished and consumer goods tariffs were reduced so that imports flooded in, but tariffs on raw materials and intermediate inputs for domestic manufacturers were higher. This is the opposite of what should have been done, so that we reduce the effective rates of protection for our domestic manufacturers very sharply. What's the answer? Well, clearly, the inverted duty structure, which has, made our effective rates of protection in many manufacturers negative, have to be corrected. This has impacted our paper products industry, chemical industry, pharmaceuticals, computers, electronics and machinery and equipment and transport equipment. So it was expected that the GST can level the playing field, but GST can only level the playing field. It provides for a refund of unutilized input tax credits where credit accumulation is on account of the inverted duty structure. But this is not consistent with an industry argument in a situation where our industries have actually suffered very severe damage. Now, by contrast, very briefly, I want to say that in the auto sector, we did not have an inverted duty structure. That's how our auto manufacturing sector has thrived. Similarly, in pharmaceuticals, it has thrived precisely because other than other complementary policies, because we did not have an inverted duty structure. Very quickly, I want to sort of make 2 or 3 other points before I close. The second dimension, second component of a of developing labor-intensive manufacturing in our country has to be, we have to provide special packages for 5 labor-intensive industries to create jobs. What are those 5 labor-intensive sectors? These were the ones which were providing jobs between 2005 and 12. They provide 50% of all manufacturing jobs. Garments and apparel is one sector, textiles, food processing, wood manufacturers and furniture, and finally leather and footwear. Here there is potential for export, but also growing domestic demand. The important point, I hark back to Prabhat's point about rising domestic demand. Between 2004 and 12, we saw rising domestic demand, as a result of which the non-farm jobs were growing, which raised consumption expenditure and simple manufacturers, pulled workers out of agriculture, and that led to a rise in consumption expenditure on an unprecedented scale, as I said, because real wages were rising. And those below the Tendulkar poverty line, for the first time in India's history, 20 million people were rising above the poverty line every year. I know the Tendulkar poverty line is a low one, but the fact of the matter is that in a 7 or 8 year period, we saw 140 million people being raised above the poverty line precisely on account of the dynamic that I've just been explaining. I just want to finish by making very quick points now about labor-intensive manufacturing. Where should our focus be? late industrializers like China, like, Northern Italy have adopted strategy of cluster development to support MSMEs, which develop production linkages with larger units. Unfortunately, our cluster development program suffers from, design problems, which I don't have the time to go into. I would if you allow me later. Fourthly, our manufacturing policy and cluster development policy would have to be also supported by a new focus on, infrastructure investment in mid-sized towns, which currently have poor infrastructure. So if we align urban infrastructure development in locations which have the clusters, and there are, by the way, 5,500 clusters across the country. Yes, you heard me right, 5,500 clusters, which can create many more jobs if we had the right cluster development policy and we invested in good infrastructure in these mid-sized towns. Fifth, of course, we have to invest much more in human resources, especially we cannot allow a situation where millions of young people who are completing secondary or higher secondary education enter into higher education at a rate at which, the higher education system has not been equipped to handle them. Result is the higher education system is creating unemployables. It's critical that these young are diverted towards a much more expanded TVET system. I've written about this at great length. In fact, I wrote the 12th plan chapter on both employment as well as skill development. Unfortunately, don't have the time to talk about it, but this has to be part of the strategy, similar to the East Asian strategy, because East Asians didn't have just an industrial policy. They had an education and a vocational education and training strategy, which was designed to underpin their industrial policy. Similarly, modern services can create many more jobs in the private sector. So far, most of these modern services jobs have been in the private sector, like telecom, IT, banking, insurance, pension, airlines, railways, tourism, auto services, which all require high levels of education and higher levels of skills. But what the government is unfortunately not investing in is public health and public education, which are highly labor-intensive activities. And if the investment was to rise to what is the goal of both the National Health Policy of 2017 as well as the new education policy of 2020, then clearly many more government jobs can also be created, because we currently have a situation where there are vacant jobs in both the health and the education sectors. I've studied the UP and the Bihar health and education sectors very carefully, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of jobs that need to be and could be created. Finally, two more components of India's manufacturing strategy, but I want to sort of focus our attention particularly on this last one, which is creating a design and innovation institutional system. Because while we have a reasonable industrial capacity, most of it is in capital-intensive sectors, as Prabhat rightly pointed out. Unfortunately, there's been a massive failure on the government's in respect of government policy. And industrial policy needs a design ecosystem, design labs that can contribute to create digital ecosystems. These design labs actually existed in the pre-1990 period. I've studied them in great detail. And if we were to focus a little bit more on that, then it would be great. I mean, I've written a whole paper about this, don't have the time to go into this, but I want to just close by talking about my last slide, and that's on this R&D. What is the way forward in respect of creating a design and innovation system? First, we cannot survive in today's world, with 0.7% by spending 0.7% of GDP on R&D. China spends about 2% plus. Korea spends about 4% plus. And even though our per capita income has been rising, absolute tax revenues have been rising, we haven't allocated more to R&D. Secondly, 70% of our R&D expenditure, of India's R&D expenditure, is by the government. Only 30% by corporates. In the world, it is the exact opposite. We've got to get the policies right to ensure that our corporates invest much more. Thirdly, the government expenditure on R&D needs to be much more through universities. That's the global pattern. Unfortunately, we spend nearly 2/3 or more of government expenditure on R&D through the CSIR labs or through atomic energy or DRDO, but not through the universities. The university system in our country has become a teaching shop system. And finally, even after increasing allocations, it'll not be enough to just get new patents or scientific papers, which our scientists are doing very well at. The government needs to examine research from a translational perspective. Patents need to be converted into products and processes. And therefore, all these 4 things need to happen. And together, all these 7 or 8 things that I've spoken about in terms of policy as part of a new industrial policy need to be put in place if we are going to create more jobs. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. So thank you very much to both the speakers for this interesting perspectives that we have got. I have got a few questions from the listeners and maybe a few of my own. Yes, Prabhat sir, you spoke about restriction in technological intervention, perhaps to ensure that it does not change the composition of the job market. But don't you think that restriction of technological intervention will actually cause a restriction in growth in overall perspective of the economy?
That depends on the economic regime within which you are. Obviously, if you are within an open trade regime, if you're in a neoliberal regime and you have restrictions on technological change, then other producers, other countries' producers would outcompete you, and you would therefore have a low or even a negative growth rate. The point is that if you change the economic regime in order to ensure that competition from others does not give rise to deindustrialization here, then you can actually have controls on technology.
So taking forward to this answer of yours, there is a question somebody has asked. They are saying that, don't you think that this technological restriction was one of the reasons of why socialist economies, failed because of a stagnation in technological intervention? Somebody has asked this question, and I thought,
I think it's a very, very fair question. I am not for a moment suggesting that there should be no technological change. Of course not. I'm talking about restraining, controlling, planning technological change. In other words, it should not be a spontaneous technological change that we go for the latest in every sphere of activity because of competition that we are facing from outside. But I think we should actually adopt a policy whereby in some sectors we adopt frontier technologies, but not necessarily in all sectors. And that is why this kind of a vector of technologies becomes essential if we're going to generate employment. And that's what I mean. Look, I mean, there is a very simple algebraic truism, namely the rate of growth of employment is equal to the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. So if you want to boost your rate of growth of employment, then for any rate of growth of output, you have to reduce or control the rate of growth of labor productivity. It's just an algebraic truism. And to do that, I'm not saying that everywhere you simply stop introducing new technology. I mean, I don't see why, for instance, in healthcare, we should not be having the absolutely frontier technology and elsewhere. But the point is that in many sectors, we can actually control technology and technological change. And obviously, one area that I gave as an example, I don't see why we should have Walmart instead of having our retail kind of traders. You would be an expert on that, but I mean that's obviously, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we have to think about.
Okay, thank you, sir. Professor Malhotra, there is somebody has asked this question, which says that there are so many jobs available, government jobs, which are there. Why isn't the government fulfilling these jobs? If they fill those jobs, vacancies that are already existent in the government sector, we would have substantive increase in jobs. Why isn't somebody looking at that? What is the reason that vacancies continue to be in government for years and they don't fill up?
Well, one reason was hinted at by Prabhat, that we are not willing to tax. Our tax to GDP ratio, believe it or not, between 1991 and 2020 has remained at around 17%, despite the fact that our per capita income has more than quadrupled. Now, this is the exact opposite of what happened in the now rich countries, that as their per capita income grew, the size of the state grew. The size of the state grew because tax revenues grew. And guess where they were spending? What was the increase of public expenditure to GDP in the now rich countries between 1880 to 1980 over a 100-year period? What was it being spent on? It was spent on three things: health, education, and social security, social transfers. That's where the states of India, as well as the union government, need to focus our attention. That requires, tax revenues increasing. But at the same time, of course, there is scope for improving efficiency of our expenditures. So both things have to happen. And clearly, we know that investments in health and education don't pay off immediately. There is a lead time. And if you invest today, clearly the investment, for instance, that the Indian state undertook in the 1990s began to pay off in the early 2000s. The data showed it. I showed that. And, you got not just an increase of allocate. You know what the allocation of, on average, under the UPA on education was? 4% of GDP. It's now 2.9% of GDP. So the point is that if you increase allocation, who brought in the MDM and universalized it to the grades 6, 7, upper primary. So all children from grades 1 to 8 received the midday meal scheme, which brought in the children. Now they're not learning enough, but they're not learning enough because we are not making the right kind of investments in their learning. So the focus should not be merely on quantitative increase in enrollment, but also on learning levels. So there is possibility there. We've gotten to a point where our young are getting much better educated than in an earlier generation. But unfortunately, at the same time, the non-farm jobs have stopped growing on account of poor economic policy management. So we've got to work on both fronts simultaneously. We have no choice. And it's critical that we work on both fronts simultaneously, because in another 15 years, our dividend is gone. We'll become an aging society.
So now this question is to Prabhat sir. Will a flexible employment policy create more jobs?
On the contrary, the flexible employment policy would actually reduce the number of jobs. See, because the number of jobs that we are now creating really depends upon, as I mentioned, it depends on the rate of growth of the output and the rate of growth of labor productivity. Okay. Now, the rate of growth of output, let us say, depends upon two things. One is our investment ratio, and the other is the incremental capital output ratio. Okay. Now, there is no reason why incremental capital output ratio should actually fall if it is the case that we actually have this flexible employment policy. There is no reason why it should make any difference to the incremental capital output ratio. On the other hand, there is no reason why it will make any difference to investment decisions, because investment currently in the economy is constrained by the fact that demand is not growing more rapidly. And as a result, you would have investment ratio remaining unchanged, incremental capital output ratio remaining unchanged, output growth rate remaining unchanged. And consequently, there's absolutely no reason why there should be any change as far as employment growth is concerned. On the other hand, if you allow this flexible employment policy, then at the margin, employers might actually get rid of some workers, so that unemployment might actually become worse than it is currently.
So, to Santosh sir, this is you spoke about as a solution to refocus on labor-intensive areas. Now, tell me, all the labor-intensive activity, for example, apparel production or leather production, etc., we are already a high-cost island. Globally, our competitiveness has gone down because there are productivity issues associated with these labor-intensive activities, primarily perhaps because of historical reason, and it is not imbibed in as in today. So if we were to relook afresh at these areas, which is labor-intensive, I have two questions for you. Is there a global demand for this? That's number one. So, or are we only going to focus on our domestic industry? In fact, just for your information, the apparel cluster in Bengal, in Calcutta, around Calcutta, that alone caters to about 25,000 crores of domestic deliveries. It doesn't export much. It's very, very insignificant, whereas Tirupur is more towards exports. So, but is it good enough? Is the domestic demand good enough to sustain and increase the quantum of employment? Number one. Where do we stand vis-a-vis Bangladesh, which has actually delivering great results in last 4 or 5 years? It's doing very well, and even the job elasticity is much higher than it is here. So perhaps double or more than double. And how do we compare with these Vietnams and Bangladeshes of the world? And what is your solution to this? And have we missed the bus, or still there is an opportunity for these labor-intensive activities? And what should the government do?
We have not missed the bus. There has been one round of exit of international firms which are from China. That is now already taking place in the light of the experience with broken supply chains during COVID of foreign firms leaving China. They're looking for locations elsewhere, including India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. I agree with you that most of the capacity has so far tended to relocate to these other countries than to us, which is precisely why my focus on packages for the labor-intensive sectors. But, the packages themselves have to be designed in such a way which take into account both export demand as well as domestic demand. I'll give you an example from textiles and garments. One of the reasons why we are not doing so well in the textiles and garments sector compared to these competitors is because we are still reliant upon cotton exports, cotton-based product exports. When the market is growing internationally, at least, and even domestically to some extent, for synthetic yarn-based products. And there is domestically only one producer of synthetic yarn, which is, the Ambani Reliance plant, who have actually tweaked, to benefit whom the government has tweaked tariff policy, which has benefited them. So in other words, we've got to fix many things which are very micro level, which need to be addressed. If we don't address those sorts of things, within those packages that I'm talking about, we're not going to be able to take advantage. I mean, this is it's a matter of detail. We've got to, sit together and talk about this. This is not something that we sort out in a webinar like this in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I agree with you all. It is a very serious issue, and of course we have too many questions, but I will take two last questions. One for
Can I just add a little bit to what I just said? If we are going to provide larger employment, if the labor market is going to become tighter, wages are going to rise, and therefore the domestic market is going to rise. We cannot, on the one hand, think in terms of enlarging employment, and on the other hand, worry about the fact that we're not able to export as much, because then the importance of exports would go down and should go down.
Yes, I agree with you. For a large economy like ours, a domestic market is a very important factor, and many foreign investors are looking at this market looking at India because of this large consumer market that is there. Well, this is a question for Professor Mehrotra. The government kind of has been saying that no, there are no problems with job, and we have created a lot of jobs, and they are trashing the CMIE data as well. Could you tell us what has been the impact of skill development and also Mudra loan that has been given? How much jobs has this created, or has it had any impact, or there is no impact of it? It's just being talked of.
The impact of Mudra has been truly marginal. Let me explain why. 95% of the loans that have been given under Mudra that the government keeps tom-tomming about, that what the government doesn't tell you is that 95% of those loans are in the Shishu category. The Shishu category are loans essentially for under 50,000 rupees. The truth is the following, that the actual average loan given under the Shishu category is 29,000. Now, what are you going to do with the 29,000 loan? You can buy a thela, you can fill it with products, you will then, once you run out and you've sold it, are you going to make enough profit to be able to make a living firstly, and at the same time repay the loan? So what we are seeing, in fact, is why the loans have been given, NPAs in this sector have been rising, and jobs are not growing. This is the big problem. As far as CMI data is concerned, they might be, your question was about CMI, right? Sorry.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, the data has been trashed.
Yeah. I mean, look, the point is, all my data was PLFS data, was NSSO data. So they trash it because it suits them to trash it, despite the fact that, PLFS is not generating the data at the periodicity that it should have. Problem number one. Problem number two is the following. The PLFS is telling us in the most recent years that the labor force participation rate is rising, worker participation, meaning jobs are rising, and unemployment is falling since 2017-18. The CMI is saying the exact opposite. Why is that? Let me explain. I had a slide about this, but I couldn't talk about this. The reason for this disjunction or divergence is the following. That the PLFS defines employment as including unpaid family labor. Now, unpaid family labor has increased very sharply between 2017 and thereafter, most recently. This is a sign of distress. It means essentially several things, because it will, when unpaid family labor increases, it will obviously show up in worker participation rising, LFPR rising. It will show up in unemployment falling. But we have to ask ourselves the question, when the economy is slowing down and slowing down sharply, if not contracting, how can LFPR be rising, WPR be rising, and unemployment be falling? This is illogical. And the logic is that it is appearing to be rising primarily because unpaid family labor. CMI doesn't count unpaid family labor as employment. Therefore, it shows the truth. Similarly, ILO does not count unpaid family labor as employment. It counts it as work, but not employment, because employment is remunerative of paid work. For the last 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics of the NSO. I continuously made the point that the ILO changed its definitions and methodology in 2013, and our PLFS came thereafter, but at the same time, the PLFS didn't adopt the new ILO methodology. 92 other countries of the world have adopted it. We continue to do what we've been doing for 45 years, 50 years. Unfortunately, nobody else uses a category called the UPSS, which uses a 365-day recall period. Bottom line is, the NSSO is being extremely stubborn. They haven't changed their approach, and we can only hope for the best. This gives them a fig leaf to tell the whole world, where's the problem? WPR rising, LFPR rising, unemployment falling, when the CMI is showing the exact opposite. This enables them to spread the disinformation and the misinformation. I had 2 slides about this disinformation and misinformation. I couldn't do it for shortage of time.
So my final question is to Prabhat sir, and it is slightly different. It has an economic and social implication. The issue is that today's youth are increasingly finding it very frustrating for jobs. They don't want to get into farm jobs because obviously their aspiration levels are higher. But in real terms, they do not have jobs. There is also a problem of the quality of education, the output, and their acceptability in the industry at large. So this is a major issue, and this youth is slowly getting frustrated. In my opinion, this could have very different kind of a repercussion over next 10 years, social repercussions. So my question is, what do you think is the reason that the quality of education that are being delivered to this youth is not finding adequate takers in the job market? Is there a lot of difference? Do you think we can incentivize farm jobs for this youth to go back to farms instead of loitering around and with very high aspiration levels? And finally, what kind of social impact or social change that you foresee in next 5 to 7 years?
I would like to suggest that all these questions have to be looked at, including the question of unemployment, have to be looked at in terms of an alternative society that we wish to build. In other words, I don't think the unemployment problem is just a matter of a fix that you just do ABC. In other words, we have to really think in terms of an alternative society that we wish to build. Now, in that alternative society, I believe that working in agriculture should not be a drudgery. Working in agriculture should not actually be, as it were, an infra dig. In other words, you have to somewhere also make it possible for people to live dignified lives, even if you're working in agriculture, even if you're in villages. In other words, again, instead of thinking in terms of transferring, the standard perception economists have is transferring large numbers of people from rural to urban areas. I believe it's important to diversify activities, to diversify occupations. Of course, we have to produce manufacturing and this and that. But on the other hand, this does not mean that millions have to be shifted out, that we have to have manufacturing in rural areas. We have to perceive a world in which the difference between the rural and the urban disappears. Not that the rural gets depopulated with the population of rural areas shifting to the urban areas, but the rural gets depopulated. In other words, I mean, it does not get deep. In other words, rural then gets transformed into urban. The difference between rural and urban disappears. Now, what kind of an organizational arrangement within which this is possible is something which needs to be thought about. I believe it would require, for instance, the introduction of cooperatives in agriculture, so that you don't have large numbers of small, petty farmers making it, whose lives become impossible to sustain. But in fact, you would have larger scale of production, cooperatives, for instance. And I don't see why manufacturing activity should not be owned by the cooperatives. Why should it be that only some industrialist sets up a plant somewhere and then the peasants are agitating against the setting up of that plant and so on? But why is it that a peasant cooperative does not own industries? So that, I mean, not only should we have a disappearance of the distinction between rural and urban, but we should also have a disappearance of the distinction between the owners of industry and the owners of farms. And it is within that context alone, that I believe we can think in terms of a future for India, where the youth would not just be dying to get away from the village. Of course, if naturally they would be dying at the moment to get away from the village, but we have to create a society in which people don't die to get away from the village. I hope I'm making.
Yes, which means that they have to be given appropriate engagement in their own setting, and so that's the challenge. And yes, Santosh sir, yes.
I would completely endorse what Prabhat has been saying, and I think what is implied, although I didn't make it explicit, what is implied in my cluster development approach, and which was the approach which was adopted by the late industrializers, including China, they focused their attention on non-farm employment in rural areas. That meant that their TVEs, the township and village enterprises, which were, collective enterprises, which were then later privatized slowly when their economic reforms began, became the basis of rural industrialization. That's what's implied in my cluster development. China's whole approach of TVE is actually very much based on the cluster development approach. So it's critical that we create many more opportunities in rural areas. And in fact, as it happens, willy-nilly, more than half, Ramesh Chand's work has actually shown that more than half of manufacturing employment in our country is in rural areas. Less than half is in urban areas. Therefore, what's important is that we have to provide the policy mix, which I wasn't able to articulate for shortage of time. The policy mix has to be right. It has been done before. We can do it. So Bharat is absolutely right. The kind of society we want to create. And it's not just that, even in agriculture, there is potential for food processing activities. I mean, obviously in rural areas, which would generate non-farm but rural jobs. That's also implicit in what I was saying. So anyway, I think this is a much longer discussion for.
I think it was extremely enriching and very, very interesting, and I think we could go on and on. There are so many questions, but all good things should come to an end. And I think thank you to both of you. It was really a pleasure to have interacted with both of you, and thank you, the organizers, for getting these two great gentlemen together on one platform. And I think the takeaways are very clear that there are possibilities, and we should look at those possibilities. And thank you very much for today's engagement, both Professor Patnaik and Professor Mehrotra. Thank you, Santosh sir. Thank you, Prabhat sir, for such an engaging discourse. Yes, Ravi Babu, I hand over to Ravi Babu to close.
Okay, thanks for such a illuminating and discussion, and also passionate. Both the speakers and the moderator were very passionate because it's to the core of their heart. It is touching, I suppose. So thanks to Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, and Sri Partho ji. And also thanks to our technical team led by Sadiq Ali and our design team, Johar Rawat and Shreya Rao. And also finally to the audience who had asked such interesting questions and participated thoroughly on the YouTube. So thanks to everybody. Our next webinar is on 28th of May. It is on the topic of economic implications of concentration of wealth in India. So one of the speakers we have already identified is Professor Pranab Bardhan of University of Berkeley. And the rest of other speaker will be identifying soon. So I request you to come back to that on 28th also. It will be again, it will be at 10 a.m. on 28th of May. Thanks everybody. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.